but tonight's topic is tack care and tack cleaning. And our guest is Libby Henderson, who some of you may know, or you may know her brand. She is the founder of Higher Standards Leather Care. So thank you, Libby, for joining us for this one.
Thanks for having me.
So me and Libby are also friends. So just so you know, this is a little bit of a conversation between friends, which is great for my first time hosting Ask the Expert. Anyway, so to address the fact that Jessa and Kinsey aren't here, obviously, if you guys have been reading any of their social media stuff, they're doing the Techstars Accelerator right now. So they are busy learning all the awesome ways to make Ride IQ even better. So they've entrusted their baby to me and the Ocala internet, which is, I'm not sure which is scarier. Choose. But we're going to try. And Libby's amazing and she's a great talker. So this should be a really good episode regardless of what I do. So that's really helpful. And we did have some really great questions in advance, so we can get to that. But first, I just wanted to let Libby kind of introduce herself and tell you a little bit about how she got started with the tack cleaning business. So Libby, tell us all about how awesome you are.
Well, I don't know that I can do that, but I can tell you how I got started. I am an attorney in my day job and run the Higher Standards Leather Care kind of as a side job. We started originally, I think my husband's comment to me was that he thought scented saddle soap was probably the stupidest thing he'd ever heard of, and he couldn't imagine anybody that would buy that. He is now my chief manufacturing and shipping person. He has a totally different opinion of it now. Originally, I had started making saddle soap when back in 2004, I had some friends needed to do some Christmas presents, found some interesting information, found some recipes, and I started fiddling with it. I wanted to see what would happen if you could make it smell good. Played around with some aromatherapy recipes. I don't know how much that makes a difference. I did have one lady one time tell me that she felt like her horse had gotten reserve champion somewhere because she had used what was a calming blend that I tested at one point. I don't know if that made a difference, but hey, if it made her feel that way, then it obviously worked in some way. But we started making it. I started making it for fun. That year, I was probably the president of Karen O'Connor's Horses Upstage, his fan club. And I sent her and Max a container of it in a care package at Rolex. I mean, I was like really a crazy fan. And Max used it. And then a couple of months later, I saw her somewhere else and she said, man, that stuff is great. Can I get more? And I remember thinking, okay, this is impressive. Somebody that does this for a living likes it. And so I made it, I think, for the next 9 years, mostly for them and still for some friends around here who liked it and started using it. And finally, Karen and Max ganged up on me at Red Hills one year and said, you really have to sell this. And I kept thinking selling it was going to take a lot of fun out of it, but it hasn't. It really has been a neat process. We ended up developing a number of different scents, and then people kept asking for a conditioner, so I've added that. And that's pretty much where we've gone with it. I don't have like a full line, and I certainly don't claim to be a leather care expert. Like, I haven't studied leather care, I haven't done leather working, but I know what I like and I know what's worked for us. So I thought it would be fun to be able to answer some questions.
I think you're selling yourself short. I think you know a lot more than you think you do. And obviously you've done a good job because your leather products are some of the most highly praised and often used in a lot of barns that I've been to. If you guys haven't, yeah, they are scented, like Libby was saying, like they smell amazing. So if you aren't familiar with it,
I've tried really hard to get it to where they smell good, but they don't smell like they would knock you over smell, if that makes sense. Because that's been one of the things that people have asked several times, like on the leather balm, it is only scented with the natural scent of the cocoa butter and things that go in it, because I didn't think that having something that stayed on your tack and soaked into the leather that had a particular smell to it was necessarily a good idea. I wasn't sure how that would smell after repeated applications on a hot day. So I want it to smell pleasant, but not overpowering.
Right. That makes sense, which I think you've achieved. Plus, you have some really fun scents like donuts, and I mean, who doesn't
We're
want?
gonna right, and I think that there's been a good bit of consumer pressure that we may have to figure out. I've been trying to convince my production line that we need to launch the donut scent as an official scent.
I
Um,
agree. I agree.
that has not happened yet. He did make sure the other day, he said, "You did write down the recipe for that, right?" So we made sure that we have that stored somewhere because he looks like I've just about worn him down on making some full batches of that. So we'll see.
That's good. He went from not a believer to a complete believer. So
He
that's
did. He absolutely did. And pretty much we are still making the product in our kitchen
yeah.
on the kitchen counter. So, it's funny because you'll see different companies, Ariat and people like that, who do sponsorships and have sponsored riders and are really good about following up with their folks and sending things just out of the blue. And at this point, I feel very grateful that so many professionals have liked it, but I can't even keep up with supplying people what they've asked for because I can't get my help to get enough work done. So, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's also a fairly good excuse that you're an attorney as your day job. I mean, I guess that's fair that it's taking you a little longer to get some soap out.
Well, I'm also not allowed to. The guy that didn't think that this was going to ever be a product anybody would want now doesn't allow me to make it on my own. So,
Right. Right.
yeah, kind of
That's
kind of
amazing.
embarrassing. So, but anyway,
Well, I'm
I'm
really
glad to.
glad that you wanted to come talk to us about this because, at first we're like, can we do a whole hour about something like this? And then the number of amazing questions that everybody submitted, I was like, I feel like this might be one of those things where people just kind of either learn it growing up or they never truly learn a correct way to do it. And it's not really something we go back and talk about because it's just assumed that everyone knows all of this stuff, which no one really does. So obviously, I
And not
think the
only that,
questions. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think there are so many different old wives' tales, and everybody's got a different way they do it. Your trainer from somewhere said this. I think one of the questions that somebody submitted said, well, my saddle rep says one thing and my trainer says another thing. I mean, I think there's a whole lot out there on what, the mystical way that this works and here's how you do things. And there are almost as many opinions as there are horse people.
Right. So then, yeah, how do you know which is the right thing and who to listen to when you're hearing so many different things? So I'm glad that you're here to set us straight or tell us what we really should be worried about or what we shouldn't. So I guess since we've got so many questions, I feel like we should kind of jump right in because I think we might run out of time um, if we don't. And obviously, if you guys have more questions as we go along, throw them in the chat and we can ask her those as we go along too. I think I've got like 10 or 15 questions already. So
Okay, perfect.
answer them as freely as you'd like, obviously. So the first question, this was a really, really, really good one submitted by Krista. How often do I need to clean my saddle, my bridle, my breastplate, that kind of thing? So how often?
Well, I think this pretty important. One of the things that I have remembered, and I've took this into account as I was developing products, what you're dealing with in leather tack is it's essentially skin. And it is skin that no longer can regenerate. I mean, ours obviously heals from the inside out if we hurt ourselves, cut something, burn something. But that is skin that's no longer living and breathing. And so I try to remember we want to take care of it in much the same way that you would. I think the phrase that I heard on one of my phone a friend answers this week was um, you want your leather to feel like a freshly moisturized face on a person. So I think that when you break it down for your saddle, I think the answer to that, at least my answer to that, is when it needs it. And you can tell by feeling if something is feeling dry, then it's going to need, or if you can see dust, if you can see dirt. Um, I don't always wipe my own saddle down every ride unless it's gotten dirty or dusty. But where the bridle is concerned, and certainly the breastplate, which I think gets even sweatier and gunkier, sweat is always your enemy. And so, as far as leather goes, and you think about how it reacts on your skin, or if you oddly enough, if you think about your horse who gets sweaty in the summer and then stands in the sun, you can see how they'll bleach out faster that way. And that's just how much more potent it makes the damage from the sun or other environmental factors. Plus, as awful as this sounds, it can also attract bugs. And so you want to make sure for bridles, I wipe those down every ride. I admire very much a system in which they are taken apart and cleaned every ride. I clean my bit as soon as I pop the bridle off. And I usually run that under running water, which is right next to my tack up area, to get any cookie goo or anything like that off my bit, because if that dries, that's really awful. But basically, I wipe my bridles down every time I put them up. Now, do I take them completely apart and disassemble them? I wish I did. I don't do that. I do know some people that is their process, and I think that's a very good process, because then you're getting in all of the nooks and crannies. And I think wiping it down every day does several things. It gets the sweat off. It gets any dirt that's come up through your horse's skin when they've gotten hot and sweaty. You'll get that off. It also allows you to check your buckles and to check around that area for wear, because that's the other thing you want to keep. A breastplate in particular, I think, is really important, because that is in a place. I think there was a question somebody had asked about how to get the particularly super gunky black goo that gets on breastplates, how to get that off. I like the sponges that we put in our soap, which are a round tack cleaning sponge. I have found those to work best, which is why we actually did a lot of testing trying to find the most appropriate sponge. I also have one that I got from either Lowe's or Home Depot that has a slightly rougher side to it. And I use that for particularly gunky stuff like a breastplate. But I think that's important to clean every time, particularly if it's something that you're counting on to hold you or your saddle in place. Gotcha. So I think too, I think you have to be careful, like with conditioning stirrup leathers and billets. You don't want to over condition those, like almost never, unless they feel super dry. But I think you have to look at them every day.
Yeah,
I have a friend that has a pretty serious, ended up with 2 surgeries on a broken arm that happened because of a broken stirrup leather, which the signs were probably there that it was starting to fray and starting to crack. And if you're not good about checking it every day, it can actually hurt you.
That's a good point. I am definitely, I don't check my stuff as often and as thoroughly as I should. And you're definitely making very good points to me as to why I should be better about that. So,
well, and the thing too, I think that with saddles in particular now, I think on my saddles, I think I have spent more on all of them than I've ever paid for a horse. And yet a lot of times we don't do the job we should in taking care of them, because they can last you. I've got one now that I use every ride that's 15 years old. And I have done, really worked hard to try to keep it. It's fading, but I happen to know somebody who has a pretty good tutorial on dyeing leather saddles, so I can fix that part.
Yeah. We might circle back around and touch on that. Touch on that topic. We got a few more things. So that's a really good answer. So basically, daily you should be wiping it down minimum and checking it for safety reasons is yes. Basically what you're saying. Yeah. There you go. It's a good answer. Here's another one that someone submitted. Who was it? Katie? Yeah, Katie. She said, I once had a saddle rep tell me that it's impossible to over-condition a saddle. My trainer said the opposite. Who's correct? How much is too much conditioner?
That is a really good question. And I think that's going to be one of those things where I wish that I had an answer to be able to say, well, 4 times a week is enough, or twice a week, or twice a month. I think, again, you really have to judge it by how it feels to you and whether or not it feels dry. I know somebody had asked, when do you know whether or not to condition? I wipe stuff down and a number of different products. My saddle soap has a little bit of conditioning stuff in it. So it's not going to strip moisture away from the leather. It puts some back in every time you wipe it down. But I think that with your saddle, it really depends. The other thing I look for, in addition to how it feels and whether it feels dry or papery to me, is how much mine squeaks. It makes a lot of noise when it has gotten dry, particularly up under the flap and where your saddle flap joins the panels. If it gets particularly dry, it'll squeak enough that I can't hear my instructor. I mean, sometimes I think they say that I just don't listen, but it does make it difficult. If it's squeaking that much, I usually try to do a deep condition on it at that point.
Yeah. So what's the downside of conditioning it too much? What could happen?
I think you can make your leather too soft by over conditioning. And I think that if you do that, and it also depends, I think we've talked some about, in reading some of the questions and looking at them, I think you've also got different sources of leather. The leather that comes from your British saddle makers is usually different grain, different type than what the French use. Different again. I mean, your Indian and Argentinian leather used to be uniformly bad and rough. I think that particularly the Argentinian leather is now way nicer than it used to be. But I think it's really going to depend on what type of tack you have. But you can, if you over condition it, you can make something, again, using the analogy of a properly cleaned and moisturized face. You don't want it to feel greasy. You don't want it to break down too fast.
Yeah. That's a really good, I've never really thought about it in terms of like your own skin, but you're so right in saying that. As far as like, I wouldn't want my skin to feel greasy, but I also wouldn't want my skin to feel, the way a dry saddle feels. That's a really good way to think about it.
And that's what I always try to keep in mind. In fact, and somebody had asked about some of the other products on the market, and I've had experience with a lot of different ones before I started making my own. And I would say that our leather balm in particular is not the end all be all. There are times when I want something that's more liquid than that is, because it's actually pretty heavy. But when I went, and people kept asking for that, so I started doing research and deciding what I wanted to do and developing that. And I went with something that the base formula for it, I altered it and fiddled with it as I developed it. But the base formula for it is a human conditioning balm, skin balm, because I wanted it to be something that once you've worked it into your tack, you've also deep conditioned your hands.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I wanted to use stuff that is all people grade. It doesn't smell like motor oil, type thing. Or bacon.
Or bacon.
Yeah, that was one of the questions, because that was particularly, I don't want to just any other products out there, but there is one that particularly smells animal fat related, and I didn't like it for that reason, because I don't want my hands to feel yucky when I'm done.
Well, does
And
something
so
like that, could that attract, like rodents or insects? I mean,
I would think so, but I would have to be cautious about that, because I think that sometimes I'm afraid our stuff smells too yummy to pests. So
that's true.
it's better to keep here, because I have found that to be the case. So I've tried to make sure. I've had some pests in my tack room that have had at one point eaten through a container. So it's apparently yummy to everybody.
Ew.
Yes. Though I've also had folks, I've had several dogs that have eaten an entire container, and someone's baby. So far, the nice part is that I don't make any claims that it is safe for people or animals to eat, but we have not killed anybody yet. That isn't to say it won't happen, but not yet.
You have to eat a whole lot of it, is what you're saying, probably.
Yes.
Okay.
I would think so.
Good to know. So you could probably lick the donut balm or the donut soap, and that would be fine. You just don't eat the whole tub.
I wouldn't eat the whole tub, no.
Okay. Good to know. I'll remember that. Okay, so Krista also asked, can you go over a best practices plan for the care of equipment? So I guess she's probably asking, like, you already talked about how often we should clean it, but kind of what's your process for cleaning and conditioning, and how often would you condition, and how, I guess?
I typically start with, I have a bucket that hangs out near my bridle, where my bridle hook is. And I've usually got, everybody that buys my soap gets the good stuff. I get what's left over. So when he has one that doesn't set up quite right, he throws it at me. So I usually have half containers of different things we've tried in the barn, but I keep that by my bridle hook. And so as soon as my bridle comes off, I rinse the bit off before. I know not everybody lets their horse eat grass and or cookies while they are riding. I do. I will admit it. I am really bad about that. And bribery is my top training trick. And so the first thing I do is to rinse off my bit when I've pulled the whole thing off. And then I hang it on the cleaning hook. And then once I am done for the day, I do wipe down bridles, check my saddle, see if it needs to be wiped. My girth is something else, along with the breastplate, that I make sure it gets cleaned every ride, because it's going to be covered with sweaty, gunky dirt and hair almost always. I mean, I would also like to be one of those people whose horses are perfectly clean every time I tack them up, but that's never happened. And after 25 years, it's probably not going to. So I make sure that those things are cleaned. One of the things that is important to me that I think of in terms of taking care of the equipment that goes on the horses is, would I be okay wearing it? Whether it's, we're not really here to talk about saddle pads. I'm actually pretty picky about those too, because as much as it is a terrible thing to have to wash them all the time, and some of them don't hold up real well to that, but I have tried to buy stuff that I am pretty comfortable washing, because my thought is, if it's matted with dirt and hair, I wouldn't want to wear it. And so I hate to put it on them, especially when we're asking them to work. They're going to get sweaty again, sweating with something that's already great. I mean, I kind of think about how I'd feel about putting on dirty socks that were dirty from the inside out. And so I try to make, yeah, and I try to think about that when I'm putting tack on them too, so that I'm not throwing something back on them that's got dried sweat and dirt and hair on it. Because that, I mean, if I'm asking them to deal with me, that's already a pretty big ask. So I try to make sure that I'm not making them. And we spend a bunch of money doing their chiropractic, and you can tell by how interested everybody is in the different experts that Ride IQ has brought on, whether it's riding experts, whether it's talking about chiropractic, talking about getting a sport horse as comfortable and going as well as possible. I feel like we owe it to them to make sure that what we put on them and ask them to wear is also as comfortable for them as it can be.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So Jessa had kind of a second part to this question, I thought. She said, what are practices that people should avoid? Like, is there anything you definitely shouldn't do with your tack?
Throwing it, tossing it back on the floor of your horse trailer dirty and leaving it there for days is not great. That's one of the things that always kind of makes me go, ooh. The other thing that happens to us in Florida, I know this is very different for different areas in the country. There are places where folks have more trouble with their tack being dry because there's not great humidity in the air. In Florida, we really have a problem with mold and mildew. And if you can store it, I know somebody had asked a question and had talked about storing things in an air conditioned tack room, and actually had talked about specific temperatures. And I don't think the temperature at which you store it is the most important thing, though I don't think that having, you kind of want to have your bit warmed up from being, you don't want it to be icy cold when you stick it in their mouth. But other than that, I think more important than the ambient temperature at which it is stored, your air conditioning, the most important thing it does, at least in Florida, is it pulls moisture out of the air. And it makes the room, it dehumidifies it. And I don't have an air conditioned tack room where I am. My stuff is in a 100-year-old mule barn, and I use one of the two corn cribs is where my tack room is. And so I did have a dehumidifier for a while, and then I realized it was just simply trying to dehumidify the entire Florida atmosphere, and that didn't work either. And so I have to monitor it for mold and mildew growth. And I actually And I do not know whether there is a leather expert in the world that would endorse this, but what I do with mine to avoid that problem is I have a gallon jug of white vinegar in my tack room, and I'll put a glug or 2 glugs of that in my bucket of water that I keep by that bridle rack, by my bridle hanger, and that will actually kill back mold spores. And trying to keep that under control is one of the most important things you can do. It will dry your leather out, so you don't want to use very much. It's Adding the vinegar in there is a great thing for cutting grime, killing mold, but it will dry your leather. And potentially, if you are using one of the leathers, like some of the British leather companies have a coating or a seal on their strap goods, it will strip some of that off. And so I try to be careful with it and don't use it every time. But I think keeping your mold and mildew beat back is a big one that on my don't want to do list, is not to let that get out of control.
Yeah, I'm glad that you just said that because I have a little bit of a bridle problem. As far as I like to buy them and collect them. um, and obviously I don't have as many horses as I have bridles. So I have a whole collection of bridles that have just been sitting. And, I moved here to Florida from Texas, and a problem I did not have in Texas was mold growing all over my tack. And I moved here and I literally grew a forest on all of my unused bridles. And I didn't really know what to do with it. And everybody just said, get a dehumidifier. And I'm like, cool, but I can't right now. So I'm definitely going to have to try your little vinegar trick because Libby, I have an entire like tack trunk full of leather at this point. That's just like gone to the forest of Florida essentially, and is just I can't get the mold off. So I'm gonna try
And
that.
that is one of the things that I would do. And then again, once you're done and it dries, that's when I would take it and feel, strictly with strap goods, and feel it. And if it feels dry, like if you would think, my hands would need lotion if they felt like this, then I would put a light coat of conditioner on it.
Gotcha.
And the
So
other thing that we haven't talked about that I think is real important if we're going to talk about things to avoid, um, I think that a lot of your, especially more higher end leather goods, comes with instructions. And I think if I were avoiding things, that I would make sure, I'm trying to think of how to say this without 3 double negatives, but I think that reading the care instructions that come with your stuff and then actually following them is really important. That is particularly important. And this is where I start to sound like one of these people who used to walk uphill in the snow both ways to school. But now your average saddle can cost as much as a used car used to cost. I mean, I have the young lady that used to work for me bought a car for less than your average nice new saddle costs today. And so they all come with care instructions. And depending on the saddle company, and that's one of the things I do get a lot of questions with our products about, well, can you use it on buffalo leather? Can you use it on this? How does it work on treated leather? My answer, the lawyer in me always answers, well, you need to test that in an inconspicuous spot. And I won't ever guarantee you that it is safe for any particular product. Like I said, I do know somebody's baby that ate some. We do not sell it as safe for baby food. But I think and I don't even recommend that you test it in an inconspicuous spot on a baby. But I think you need to, you have to always recommend testing it somewhere that if there was a problem, it wouldn't ruin your saddle. But the more important thing to do is to look at what kind of warranty your saddle came with. I know today we had one person say that there is a saddle company that's kind of local to me that says they never recommend soap on your saddles. There is another major US manufacturer of saddles that I have heard that their recommendation is the same thing. And the big tricky thing here is that you don't want to void your warranty. I have another sponsored rider who was with us for a while and was heartbroken when she switched saddlers because she switched to somebody whose warranty was, you use the products that we make and sell for our saddles or it will void your warranty. And she couldn't work with us anymore. And And that is certainly understandable, because the most important thing, I don't ever want anybody to feel like they would be in danger of jeopardizing. Again, saddles are now a seriously major investment.
Right.
And I think that you need to make sure that you are following the recommendations of your saddler for what they say to use.
Right. So sure. So basically read the instructions if it comes with it.
Yes.
Read
Yes.
the instructions.
Always.
Horse people aren't always so great about that.
No.
So, okay.
The lawyer in me wants everybody to read and follow instructions.
Yeah, that was a comment. Libby showing her lawyer.
Yeah, my husband calls it the lawyer labels, the stuff that warns you about what to do and what not to do.
Yeah. So I have a question based off of that, but I feel like I should ask the one in the chat before I completely forget about it.
Okay.
So is there an ethically made, not animal tested component to leather cleaners?
Wow. That's where I'm going to use the cheap phrase. Gee, that's a really good question, while I sit here and try to think of the answer. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. We'll have to follow up with that one. I thought it was an interesting question too. I've never really even thought about it. I mean, yeah, we'll have to circle back to that one maybe.
And you see my brain is spinning here, because I'm trying to think of the ingredients. I mean, I can tell you that our products are ethically made in the fact that I suppose my husband would claim that I have him in a sweatshop stuck in the kitchen. But essentially, I'm trying to think of the raw ingredients that we use. If there is, I'm not even sure if the raw ingredients we use would be, I can't think of anything that we do use. Like, for instance, I don't use palm oil, which is one of the things that is considered a problem. It involves rainforest deforestation of the rainforest, as well as there's some harvesting issues with that people have had concerns about. And so I have, in making the choices that we made when we chose what to put into stuff, for instance, in finding a particular oil, the whole process of creating a brand and building a product was super interesting for me, because it's nothing like I've ever done before. And in things like testing the oils that we use, we thought about things like making sure that the palm oil was not one I was interested in. I don't use the bleached the bleached beeswax.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, since we do use beeswax, then I would say that it makes my products not vegan. So I'd never actually thought about that, but I have a hard time remembering sometimes that bees are animals too.
Right. So don't lick the soap if you're vegan, is what you're saying.
I think that would probably be correct.
Okay.
Although I think a lot of folks that are strongly vegan probably aren't cleaning leather anyway. So I have not actually ever thought about that.
That's true. That's a good point.
And I would not use, I can say that, for instance, our products would be the same as for a lot of leather products. You do want to be careful. I know somebody had a question in some of the stuff that was pre-posted about preference for rain materials. And I think that is so individual, because I am so twitchy about my own they have to be rubber reins. They have to have the right thickness of rubber. I've now been turned on to some that have stops, which I've never used before, because that's going to be a way to keep me from not letting my reins get too long. But essentially, I am really careful about not letting our soap in particular, because it does have some conditioning oils in it. I try to make sure that stays off of rubber reins, because if you've ever had a melt, it's usually, now we don't have a petroleum product in our soap, but fly sprays that are oil-based can make your reins melt. And so that's something that I try to be really careful about. So I hadn't thought about that before, but I would imagine that a number of any type of saddle soap that's going to be a conditioning soap is potentially going to have something oil-based in it. So you want to be careful. I use only plain water in cleaning rubber reins and rubber pieces of things.
Yeah, that's a good point. So my question, leaping backwards a little bit, when would you use actual like leather balm, leather conditioner versus oil? Like what situations would warrant which? And what type of oil would you use if you were using oil?
We don't actually make anything that is a more liquid conditioner that's like in our brand. And so, to be utterly honest with you, when I need something that is more liquid than my leather balm, I tend to grab the oil that we use as a component of that because I have it at home. And I specifically chose it because it is, once I started studying these things, I discovered there are different oils that have different, there's some stuff that soaks in quickly and all that kind of stuff. So I frequently will grab the safflower oil out of the house if I've got something that really needs a liquid. Um, I use my leather balm on most things because it goes on. In fact, our directions, and this is something that I felt like it was the best way to do the directions on the leather balm when I first started making it, but I almost never follow my own directions. You won't hurt yourself by using it. I mean, it's not anything wrong with it, but I like to melt it in my hands because then it gets to almost basically the cocoa butter that we use in it will melt at body temperature. And since it is developed from a recipe for human cosmetics, um, and home cosmetics type things, I can melt it in my hands, deep condition my hands while I'm doing it, and then I apply it with my hands. And again, I use it like on the leather balm in particular, I'll put on my saddle when my saddle is squeaking and I know that it's gotten dry up inside and I can get the leather balm in my hands way softened and work it into all of the smaller pieces. I do find that on anything that has visible stitching, that you need to be really careful with a leather balm like ours, which returns at room temperature to a solid. Because if you get it down in the small holes of stitching, decorative stitching of any kind, and you aren't really careful to buff it out, it will set back up as a solid in those crevices and holes. So I try to be very careful about that. If I do use my stuff on my strap goods, I've melted it really good in my hand, and I essentially use my hands to wipe it on and wipe it off. Because again, anything that is a solid at room temperature is going to set back up on your tack. And
Right.
so if you don't want that to happen, if it is too cold to get that soft product like that or any of the other products on the market soft enough, I think that's a good time to use an oil or a product that's liquid. It's also easier.
Yeah.
Because, and if you don't like getting it on your hands, you can put an oil goes better on a rag or a cloth and can be wiped on.
Right.
So, and you do want to be careful when you are using a conditioner not to over condition things. I think somebody had made reference to getting a bridle soft and floppy. And I think that is when we talked about things to avoid. I think that goes on your avoid list. You don't ever want it to be that soft because if that's happened, you've started to break down the cells in your leather and it won't last as long.
Gotcha.
Same thing with letting it get way dried out because once it starts cracking, you have a problem.
Right. You can't fix it.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had a lot of people say, you know, I get a lot of success stories and people sending me pictures, which I love, by the way. Anybody that wants to do that, someday I will either sell enough soap that I will hire somebody like Amanda to do my social media and it will actually be out there. I do have a pretty good collection, though, of pictures that people have sent me. And they feel, you know, I get a lot of good feedback saying that our products are really good at saving stuff they thought was beyond saving. But even as much as I want to pat myself on the back and take that praise, once your leather starts to crack, you can't fix it. So if you get some cracks, particularly that are bad, I think we talked earlier about rarely moisturizing your or conditioning your billets and your stirrup leathers because you don't want them to stretch. On the other hand, you do want to be very careful about them not getting too dry and starting to crack because then that's when you get things that break and tear.
Right. Right. That makes sense. So you're talking about different leather types like the English leather, Italian leather, French leather. Do you do different types of care for the different types of leather?
I think the answer to that is yes. What I own personally is predominantly English. And so I have followed their recommendations, and you get some of the strap goods and whatnot that are a little bit more sealed. I do not have any French saddles in my personal collection, but they are so much softer, and the leather in those feels like a super soft leather couch. And so, from what I understand, your saddles manufacturers have a bit of a different care guide there, and you don't want to you don't want to over condition anything. But I think it is easier to over condition the softer leathers because they're already a more open pore construction.
Mm.
And so you want to be careful about that. The other thing that when we were talking about things to avoid, you obviously want to avoid your leather getting completely wet. But we've all had a cross country run in pouring rain.
Yep.
And when that does happen, here's another thing that I think is really important to avoid is that once something gets completely soaked through, that is the one time I think that you can condition it before it's cleaned. I think that was one of the other questions. Somebody said, can you just throw conditioner on something that you haven't cleaned yet? I wouldn't do that as a general rule because then you're taking a rich, at the basis of almost every conditioner is going to be some sort of oil, and putting it on top of dirt, and then you're kind of mushing that around. But if your leather has gotten completely soaked, it needs a thorough conditioning before it dries out, because it will dry out, get brittle, and crack. For instance, if you and your saddle have taken a tumble into the water jump, which we hope never happens to anybody, or you've just gone cross country in an absolute pouring rain, that would be one of the things that my recommendation in that situation would be to take a soft cloth and wipe any visible dirt and gunk, or similar to, I hope this never happens to anybody, but I showed up at the barn one day and found that my trainer was missing, and found the horse standing in the field. And then when I untacked, I discovered there was dirt and whatnot really lodged, because clearly at some point the horse had fallen with her. And in cleaning that up, that was a good time to take something soft, I think I just knocked all the dirt off, and then did a good cleaning and conditioning on the saddle, because it had fallen in a wet and muddy spot. And so that's important but I hope nobody ever goes through that. It's kind of scary when you can't find the rider and you only find the horse. That I would not recommend that. That was not fun.
That doesn't sound ideal. That doesn't sound ideal. So we've got more questions. So Emily had so many great questions. I'll throw them at you one at a time. Because the way she listed them in a way that my brain would have done it, like question. I was like, I like this. I'll break them up for you. So she was asking about glycerin. Like, a lot of people just use old school glycerin. Is that a good cleaner still? Is it outdated? If so, do you do it before you clean or condition with something else? What's your thoughts on the glycerin?
I have not ever. We use a there is a soap-based glycerin. Our soap has glycerin in it. I have never used it as a sealant. And again, that's when there's so many different ways that people do things. And I've never seen it used that way, and I have never done that. I think that has become an outmoded suggestion, because leather being skin, you don't want to seal it off. About the only thing that I can think of that you might want to seal was going to be a leather boot, like your dewberries or something that you were going to wear in a water jump. But as a general rule, you don't want, the leather actually needs to breathe. And so I think that using anything as a sealant, like the glycerin as a sealant, like people used to talk about, I wouldn't recommend.
Gotcha. Okay. Let me do this chat question real quick, because my brain. So what are your thoughts on buying used tack? Would you have any pointers? Would you do that? Would you not? What are your thoughts?
I'm a big fan because, for instance, I didn't need another jump saddle, but I saw one come up used on probably Facebook Marketplace at a good bit less than I actually thought it was. Anything is worth what somebody will pay for it, but this one was a saddle I was familiar with. It was the right size for my mare. She's not jumping at all at this point. She probably doesn't need 2 jumping saddles, but I'm a big fan. I'm particularly a big fan of used saddles because it is so difficult anymore. And you see so many people's horror stories of having ordered a quote unquote custom saddle for them and their horse, and it comes in and it's wrong, and then you've waited 12 weeks and it doesn't fit and it's not perfect. And anytime that I think that you can find something that like saddle that's used. I also have a couple of good, our saddle fitter that comes to us is very good. And not only does she check the fit of saddles and sell some, but she also does a lot of repair. And there's also somebody else on the East Coast that I really like for repair. And I think that if you can find something that you can ride in today, saddles in particular, that you can see if it fits your horse, you can test it, you actually have it there in person, the right shoe size, the right seat size, you know whether it works, the point of balance works for you. I think that if you can do that and purchase one like that, I would much rather do that. Plus somebody else has already broken it in. And that's with the caveat that you check things very carefully. You check the billets, you check the tree, you check the wear points, and you know what can and can't be fixed. I just had on one of my saddles that I bought in 2008, I guess. I bought it new, but I've just had the panels replaced and the billets replaced on it. And so it's amazing what some of the good repair folks can do. They can replace, I know somebody else has just had the seat replaced. The saddle itself structurally is in great shape. It looked a little bit worn. So she had the seat replaced and had some really cool colored trim added. And I think there are a lot of things, again, so many of these saddles anymore cost what you used to. I mean, the used car market's also going crazy, but you used to be able to get a decent used car for what we're spending on saddles. So I think that particularly saddles, I am also game, particularly if you're looking for, I just sold a bridle through that I just had barely used and it wasn't working for us. And I went ahead and sold it. So I think that if you can find anything like that that you're looking for and you have the opportunity to inspect it and make sure that it isn't breaking, that it isn't worn out, that it doesn't have a problem, I'm a big fan of buying used because this stuff's expensive.
Yeah.
The things that I wouldn't pick up used, I probably would not pick up used stirrup leathers.
That's a good point.
Because I want to know that those are going to be safe and strong, and I'm pretty picky in the ones that I like and don't like. So
yeah. What about girths?
I have done it. I probably should have a used girth sale at my house because the chest that you're talking about, you have full of bridles. I have one of those full of girths. I think I have a girth size for everything from a pony to a really big barrel chested horse. So I've got a bunch of different sizes and a bunch of different shapes, and I should probably unload them. But again, I think as long as it's strong and it's in good shape, you can check the elastic if it has it. I think it's a really good way to pick something up, to try it. And if you decide that it's not the right color or you decide that it's got more wear than you would have liked, it at least gives you the opportunity to try something at a lesser price, and then you can replace it with a new one of the same model if it does work for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Cool. Another question from Emily. Is it best to stick with the same line of tack care all the way through, or can I swap out certain items from other brands?
I think that it's fine to swap out. I mean, I know that there are probably some tack care systems that will claim that their cleaner works best in conjunction with their conditioner. But I think probably the most important thing is to choose your tack care, whatever system and products you choose, is to choose the ones that you will be most likely to use.
Gotcha.
Because it doesn't do you any good if you don't use it.
Right. So a lot of the French brands that come with like their own soap and conditioner and oil, do you think it's necessary to stick to those, or should people feel free to branch out if they like something else more?
It depends on what your warranty says on your tack. If you've
Lawyer
bought a
Libby.
saddle, yep. If you've bought a saddle that recommends using their product on it, check your fine print and make sure that if you use something else, it won't void your warranty. Other than that, I think theoretically, I don't even know how other people have developed their products. I think theoretically, they may have developed them specifically for that leather. I know that ours are developed to be a good all-around product. I will say that it was one of those moments back in December. I was at an event that was sponsored by a particular saddle brand, and they were giving away their conditioner as we all left, which was kind of interesting. I got to see, somebody else's product, though it's when I opened it and looked at it, it was very similar to what we make. And as we left in the elevator, and we're going downstairs, one of the other people who I'd never met before, I did, of course, have on logo wear because, of course, you go everywhere in your product logo wear. And she looked at me and she said, "Yours sure smells better." And I've been going. This was somebody I'd never seen before, and she figured out who I was based on the logo on my shirt. And I probably didn't touch the ground again for the next 24 hours because that was really neat to have. I always feel a little bit like that old Sally ride with us. She says, "Oh, you like me. You really like me." I always feel a little bit like that when I run into somebody that does like our stuff. So that will always make my day.
I liked your stuff before I knew it was your stuff. Like it. So I used it before I knew it was you. So
that's always nice that there is nothing that will make me happier, because again, it was something that when we set out to do it, I didn't do it because I was a particular leather care guru, or I've always been particular about taking care of my tack. I mean, I would not want to invite you guys into my own tack room presently, because we've had a lot of rain and it's been kind of icky, but I've always thought it was important. It's always mattered to me, and being able to start making it. And there are some products out there that, in my opinion, smell really bad. And that was what motivated me. Was I want to make something that when you do this chore that nobody likes doing every day, because frankly, by the time you're done, you put your horse away, you're done for the day. The last thing you want to have to do is to do more cleaning. And I wanted that to be a pleasant experience, which is one of the reasons that we wanted to make it. I mean, I've got several things. In fact, the one we named them after, all of the soaps are named after favorite horses. And I have now lost, I think, all 4 of our main scents. We've lost all 4 horses now. But they were all named after horses that were important to me. And the only one that has a specific aromatherapy type blend to it is the one named after Upstager Woody, which is the Confidence blend, because that was my favorite thing about him, because he was so little and everybody said he wasn't very good at this. And he went out and did Kentucky 7 times in a row, for instance. So he was pretty cool.
Yeah.
So that was, but I did want to be able to make something that people were happy to pick it up at the end of the day when you're finishing that last chore. I want it to be something that somebody smiles when they open the jar because it smells good.
Yeah, that's good.
So
we're getting short on time, so I think I'm going to pick 2 more questions.
Okay.
I have one for the end that I think will be a good wrap up, but let's fit one more in there.
Okay.
So we had one emailed in that says, "I have a dressage saddle that has a pitted texture to the leather, like a grain. Dust has settled in there and I can't seem to get it to ever look clean. How would I clean this?"
And that's a hard thing to do without actually seeing the leather, because if in fact it's intended to be the grain of the saddle is, and I say that because I actually had a saddle that the panels on it went kind of pebbly over time, and it wasn't an intentional thing. In fact, what I have come to learn is that particular saddle company had a period of time that they had what I guess the person that did the repair for me called it a bad batch of leather that tended to bubble and pit. But if this is an intentional grained leather, my first thing, again, being the bad lawyer, would be to say, I would reach out to the company and say, "I'm having problems feeling like I can get this clean. What do you recommend?" If it is a waxy buildup, it is probably going to take some elbow grease and heat of application. If that's it, because it's so hard to know, because most of the time you don't have dust that accumulates. I mean, if it is in fact just dust, a shoe shine brush that they sell in the shoe care section at Walmart. They'll sell a really, really soft brush. And I think if in fact you're dealing with just dust, that's probably safe. Um, but if it's not coming up with a soft cloth, it's probably not dust. And so I think you'd have to do some more investigation to figure out actually what it is that's making the leather not look clean.
Right. Could it be
And
like
that would,
product residue from soap or?
I think so, yeah. And that's one of the things that I think is really important too when people are doing tack cleaning, no matter what product they're using, you want to use the soap to get things clean. I try to not have it foam too much. So you want your soap to your sponge to be only slightly wet. And I always, in fact, I think our directions specifically say to apply it and then go back and wipe it off. Because if you do leave a soap or a conditioner, like particularly if you're using one of the conditioners like ours, which is pretty much solid at room temperature, once you have applied it and it's cooled back down from the friction of putting it on, it can set up in anything like that is rough textured. If you have residue, it will set back up. And so that would be the question, would be to do some more exploring on it to see whether if it's just a rough grain leather, if you've used something on it that is sitting there that's residue.
That makes sense. Yeah. A lot of the comments are saying that we should have a Ride IQ garage sale because
that's not a bad idea.
Everybody has extra tack. My problem is I don't want to get rid of any of it. I just want to hoard it.
I have several boxes. I mean, I've got all my endurance tack because I could go back to doing that. So
no.
It could happen. Yeah, at some point I will have to have somebody like you come and do the big clean out because you're good at deciding. It's also easier to do it for somebody else because
Libby,
then you don't have an emotional attachment to it. So
Libby, I just told you I have a whole container full of bridles.
but they're yours and you like them and they're your children, so you can't get rid of them. So, but I can't say anything. I have boxes of extra tack in my tack room.
You never know
2 rideable horses. Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, is that who gets rid of bits?
No one.
Because I used to like it when Ralph Hill showed up with his bit bag, because I have now one of those too. Actually, I have 2 buckets.
Yeah. I don't want to tell you what I have. I have an undisclosed number of locations that I keep an undisclosed number of bits in for undisclosed reasons.
Well, you don't ever know what you would need. And as soon as you get rid of it, you're going to need, for that particular horse, it's going to come in with a different size mouth. And
exactly. Yeah. The Presto has a much larger mouth than Henry. And I'm like, oh no, I have to go buy all these same bits in a larger size. What a travesty.
We need a bit lending library. I mean, I know several companies do that, but maybe that's what Ride IQ needs to do, is to have a lending library section where people could borrow things and try them out before they had to buy them.
Everybody just puts their stuff in a pile.
Yeah.
All right, we've got a couple minutes left, so let's wrap up. This was another question from Emily that I thought would be really good. She said, mostly I would like to just learn more about different leather types, dyes, tanning, how they affect the care and cleaning. Is there a good resource for us to be able to find this information and learn it on our own? So do you have any suggestions for how people can go about researching this and where, that kind of thing?
My first question is, Emily must be a 5 on the Enneagram. So, but I think the very best, in my opinion, the very best resource for that kind of information is going to be somebody like my saddle fitter in particular, who also she's now making saddles, she's making leather chaps, she's making different, I mean, she posted the other day she'd made a pair of shoes. So I think that somebody that has that kind of knowledge, there's a lot of information, as there always is on every subject on the internet. But I think if you can put your hands on somebody that you can ask questions of, there is a lot of stuff out there on how stuff is tanned, how leather is sealed, what dyes stick here and there. I think that if you can talk to somebody who is a craftsman who does it for a living is the very best thing. And I have two in my Rolodex of, or in my contacts list now. Nobody has Rolodexes anymore. That I could always, if she wants to get a name of a contact, I can share those with her. I've also, obviously, there's so much out there when you just start researching. One of my dreams is someday to go to saddle fitting school myself, so I could actually learn how a lot of this works.
Yeah.
But I think putting your hands on as much different leather as you can and looking at it yourself and paying attention to what people use, what people like, touching and feeling it in tack stores. I mean, it's a good excuse, if nothing else, to go wander around a tack store and look at a lot of different things.
So should you be looking at like where it's made, or is there something on the tag that might help tell you like what kind of leather it is?
I think and again, I don't think there's a standardization for that, though that information is a lot of times, especially if the company considers it a selling point, it'll be pretty obvious. But I think that the more stuff you can touch and look and see, okay, this is French, or this is Italian, or this is from the traditional school of English saddle making, I think that you can begin to start to tell what you like, what feels good, and then pay attention to what you've bought and used and what other people have in your barn.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have, there may be a big book of leather and information. In the past, as I've researched things, trying to develop products that work on certain things. And I've also done a little bit of leather work myself because I wanted to learn how things worked, how they started. I've done some stuff that I've dyed from undyed to dyed, mostly in making some smaller leather goods stuff. It's harder than it looks.
Yeah.
And trying to create a product that you can dye and then not have the dye come off is a lot tougher than it looks. There are a couple of big leather warehouse type places that I know that are in Florida. I'm sure other places have them too, where you can actually wander through. I did that in Tampa at one point and wandered through and touched a lot of the different types of hides, different looks, different things. And that was super educational. But mostly what I've done with it is to reach out and touch things and look up specific questions.
Right. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good point. Yeah, pay attention to what you're looking at and get your hands on as much as possible.
I think that's, and anybody that boards in a barn where there are other folks has a real, unless you are riding somewhere that the trainer tells everybody to buy the same thing, you have so much stuff available to you.
Yeah.
I mean, I have that kind of variety with my tack collecting problem at my house, and I'm the only one there. But in a lot of places, you can reach out and say, okay, well, your saddle's different than mine, or that's a cool girth, and do you like it? And so I think that's pretty important. It's just a lot of it's going to be feel.
Right. Well, so we're at an hour, and I knew we wouldn't get to all the questions. I knew it. We had so many, which was amazing. A lot of people are interested in this, and I feel like we could keep talking about this for a while. Like, I'm very interested in what you have to say, but we've reached our time point. So I guess if there are more questions, maybe we can do some follow-up in the Facebook group, or find some resources for people.
And I appreciate everybody coming up with questions, because it's one of those things when you sit down and think about it, you think, man, tack care, well, you just keep it clean and you try to keep it safe and you try to keep it conditioned. But people had a lot of detailed questions, so that was very helpful. So thank you to everybody who sent in questions. And there's so many opinions about it and old wives' tales, and you'll get 2 horse people together and get 6 opinions. So
on everything, but especially this.
Yeah.
Well, somebody, I can't tell who said that in this chat. It says, I want Enneagram number themed higher standard scents. That had to have been Steph.
That might be fun. That could be fun, because they had there's somebody out there that makes candles for your Enneagram.
Holly said that.
Well, we can certainly do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone that
thank you guys.
in. And I'm glad that my Ocala internet didn't try to sabotage our discussion. And hopefully that was good. So thank you
Thank
for
you, guys.
everyone. Yeah, thank you, Libby. Thank you so much. You were a very easy first guest for me. That wasn't painful at all.
Well,
So
you
I
did a great
appreciate
job.
you.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate you. You did a great job too. So thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you next week.